Here's what happened across the U.S. in the past hour, all in 60 seconds. New York Gov. Kathy Hochul ruled out income tax hikes as she unveiled a $260 billion budget. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani is pushing higher taxes on top earners to fund his agenda. Air Force One carrying President Trump returned to Joint Base Andrews after crew reported a minor electrical issue. The White House said everyone was safe, and the Davos trip continued on another plane. Organizers in Columbus planned a Free America walkout at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, calling people to leave work or school and rally at the Ohio State House. The protests target Trump's immigration crackdown. A conservative group sued Los Angeles Unified, arguing a desegregation program illegally steers extra resources and magnet school points to campuses with mostly non-white students. The district says it remains committed to educational equity. New Jersey Governor Mikie Sherrill declared an emergency over electricity costs and froze the supply rate for customers. She blamed grid constraints and rising demand and said regulators will hold utilities accountable. Justice Department officials served grand jury subpoenas on the offices of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. DOJ is probing allegations that leaders obstructed federal immigration enforcement during the crackdown. Texas Governor Greg Abbott activated state emergency resources ahead of a winter storm expected to bring freezing temperatures, snow, and ice. Officials urged drivers to check road conditions and prepare for possible power outages. The Trump administration said in a court filing that DOJ staff tied to Elon Musk improperly accessed sensitive Social Security data. It prompted calls for audits and stronger privacy controls. Here's what happened across the U.S. in the past hour, all in 60 seconds. Representative Julia Letlow launched a Republican primary challenge against Senator Bill Cassidy for Louisiana's U.S. Senate seat. The race follows President Trump's endorsement and sets up a high-stakes GOP fight under the state's new partisan primary rules. Congressional leaders reached a bipartisan funding deal aimed at avoiding a John 30 government shutdown. The package would finance key agencies, including DHS, as lawmakers debate immigration enforcement and oversight requirements. Governor Phil Murphy pocket vetoed 2 immigrant protection bills in his final hours in office, citing legal and funding risks. He signed a narrower measure on sensitive locations, leaving broader limits on cooperation with ICE unresolved. President Trump defended ICE after an agent fatally shot Renee Good during a Minneapolis operation. He called her death a tragedy, but said enforcement can make mistakes as demonstrations and investigations continue. Lawmakers released an $839 billion compromise defense spending bill that funds Pentagon priorities and major weapons programs. The package includes money for F-35 purchases, readiness, and new aircraft development as Congress moves toward final votes. U.S. forces seized another oil tanker tied to Venezuela, the 7th vessel taken under a new maritime quarantine. Officials said the ship violated sanctions restrictions as Washington moves to tighten control over Venezuelan oil flows. Federal Immigration and Border Patrol officials held a Minneapolis news conference on Operation Metro Surge and said arrests have climbed into the thousands. Local leaders pressed for answers on tactics as protests and court challenges continue. St. Paul Police Chief Axel Henry and other Minnesota law enforcement leaders said they've received complaints that ICE agents are stopping U.S. citizens based on appearance. They called for clearer federal oversight and accountability. Here's what happened across the U.S. in the past hour, all in 60 seconds. Air Force One turned back to Joint Base Andrews after a minor electrical issue shortly after takeoff for Davos. Trump switched to another aircraft and continued to Switzerland after a delay. Organizers of the Free America walkout planned demonstrations in Columbus this week to protest federal immigration raids and possible troop deployments. Police and city leaders say they are preparing for large crowds downtown. Congressional negotiators released an $839 billion defense spending compromise for fiscal 2026, funding major weapons buys and next-generation aircraft. Lawmakers still must vote before a January 30 deadline. The Justice Department served grand jury subpoenas on offices of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Twin Cities mayors. Officials say the probe focuses on whether they obstructed federal immigration enforcement. Federal immigration agents expanded enforcement in the Minneapolis area after the fatal shooting of Renee Good during an ICE operation. City and state leaders say the surge has fueled protests and calls for oversight. U.S. forces seized a Venezuela-linked oil tanker in international waters as part of enforcement of U.S. sanctions, officials said. Venezuelan officials condemned the move and warned it could disrupt shipments. Congress released a bipartisan $1.2 trillion funding package to avert a shutdown ahead of a John 30 deadline. The plan boosts ICE oversight funding while keeping major education and health programs largely intact. The Trump administration defended an ICE agent involved in the Minneapolis shooting of Renee Good and criticized local officials for opposing the crackdown. Minnesota leaders demanded more transparency as protests continued. Maryland's redistricting commission approved a new congressional map, despite criticism from some lawmakers and community groups. The plan now heads to state leaders as legal challenges remain possible. The Supreme Court signaled it may strike down California's ban on carrying guns in many public places like restaurants and stores. A ruling could expand where permit holders can carry statewide.